Hi, you're on the This Is Crime channel. I'm Matilda. Listen to my new story. Sverdlovsk SUBHUMAN, the story of the youngest maniac of the USSR. In the 1930s, there were no such concepts as maniac or pedophile. Sexually motivated murders were rare and mostly hushed up, and no one had heard of a series of murders at all. The magnificent school of investigation, formed in the Russian Empire for almost 2 centuries, was destroyed at the root by the Bolsheviks in less than a decade. In the criminal investigation was taken not by vocation and ability, and by working-class origin, so the police lacked not only professionals, but also simply competent employees. In the fall of 1938, Sverdlovsk was shaken by the rape and murder of Gerda Gribanova, who was only 4 years old. The girl disappeared from her own yard in broad daylight, and soon her body with a severed right arm and leg was found in the bushes of cherry trees near the house. The expert examination established that the child was killed by 8 stabbing blows to the head, and before that, the murderer strangled the victim with his hands. The only clue that investigators had was the broken-off tip of the knife, which was left in the skull of the victim. It must be said that it was not much, considering that the Sverdlovsk law enforcers did not have any special technical equipment. While the police were going around the neighborhood and looking for a broken or recently resharpened knife, the murders in the city began to happen one after another. The pattern was similar everywhere. A child aged 2 to 4 years old was kidnapped right outside the house, and it happened in the daytime, when there were many people around. In one case, a girl disappeared right from the entrance of her own house, where her mother sent her while she was putting on her shoes in the hallway. The corpses of children were then found on the outskirts of the city in the woods, in vegetable gardens, in abandoned buildings, in the pit latrines of public toilets. All of them had been strangled or killed with a knife, and in most cases, raped in an unnatural way. There were survivors among the victims. 4-year-old Borya Titov was abducted in the early winter of 1938 from the porch of his own house with his sled and miraculously escaped death. The boy's mother, who had already heard about the murders in the city, did not call the police and rushed to look for her child herself. She was lucky. The man dragging the sled with her son was found at the end of a neighboring street. The woman raised a ruckus, and the intruder, fleeing from his pursuers, turned into a back alley, threw the child into a snowdrift, and fled. Borya was rescued, but due to his young age could not describe the kidnapper. Another witness was 4-year-old Raya Rakhmatulina, who was dragged by the killer into a toilet box in the yard of her house. The maniac was disturbed by the noise in the yard, so he slashed the girl's face with a knife and threw her into a cesspool, hoping she would drown. Raya was born in a shirt, as the wounds were not fatal, and several cubic meters of liquid waste had been pumped out of the pit the day before. The child was frightened and could not accurately describe her attacker, being confused not only about clothing, but also about gender. Everything was aggravated by the fact that Raya, like her parents, spoke very little Russian and was in a state of shock. 3-year-old Alia Gubina also survived, who was also stolen from the yard by a subhuman, dragged to a forest park zone, and raped. The criminal stabbed the girl several times, one of which literally gutted the child. It happened on a weekend day in a few dozen meters from the resting company, and no one noticed anything. Alia was found in a pool of blood among her own entrails. The child's wounds, even at the modern level of medicine, would have been considered fatal, but Sverdlovsk surgeons during a 16-hour operation performed a miracle and saved the girl. Once again, no witnesses, no evidence. The monster left behind nothing but mutilated children. The shard of the knife, even after 5 child deaths, was still the only iron evidence. The investigation was at a hopeless dead end. Scouring the yards and questioning the locals was fruitless. It was a case when proletarian endeavor could not achieve anything, It required professionalism, which Sverdlovsk law enforcers lacked. The work of the investigators was complicated by the situation prevailing in society. The atmosphere of fear caused by Stalin's repressions made many people shun the police. There was also another extreme. In the first days after the rumor spread through the city that they were looking for the murderer of Gerda Gribanova, the district police were attacked by applicants who knew exactly who the murderer was and were ready to give his name and exact address. Usually, the culprit of all the troubles turned out to be a neighbor in the communal apartment, whose living space the applicant wanted to get his hands on. Also, foes who had quarreled on domestic grounds settled accounts with each other in such an extravagant and dangerous way. The first two killers, seized on the tip-off of vigilant neighbors, confessed to all crimes. They had to be released because of their obvious ignorance of the details of the crimes, and most importantly, because of the ongoing murders. Almost a year passed, and the gruesome crimes did not stop. The testimonies of rare eyewitnesses to the kidnappings diverged. One time, investigators were described a 17-year-old unkempt boy with a diction defect, and the other, a stately old-fashioned lady. The killer expanded the geography of his crimes, and cases of missing children began to be recorded in neighboring Nizhny Tagil. The course of the case was already being closely monitored from Moscow, sending inspectors and experts to the city time and time again. In light of these events, the main police department of the city of Sverdlovsk decided to organize an unprecedented in the USSR on the scale of the operation, which was to be attended by hundreds of police officers and cadets of military schools, disguised as civilians. Patrols consisting of 2-3 people were dispersed throughout Sverdlovsk and moved within sight of each other. The participants in the operation received weapons and were thoroughly instructed. All adults who were on the street with children between 1 and 7 years of age and who behaved suspiciously or restlessly were ordered to be detained. The raid completely exposed the militia's rear, as absolutely all officers, including desk officers, were involved. Ordinary citizens were not involved in the operation, as this could have been a source of information leakage and forced the killer to lie low. For the Sverdlovsk Criminal Investigation Department, it was a dangerous move driven by desperation. In case of failure, all the leaders would face an article on sabotage. In the capital, they would not be forgiven for completely stopping the work of the Sverdlovsk police. Fortunately, the perpetrator was caught right on the scene shortly after the operation began. The last victim of the Sverdlovsk monster was almost 3-year-old Slava Volkov, who was kidnapped at the entrance, where his mother had left him for a moment. The killer felt that the ring around him was shrinking, so he was not afraid to drag the victim into a streetcar to get away from the pursuit. At one of the stops on the outskirts of the city, a man with a child who got off the streetcar seemed suspicious to the cadet patrol, and the guys carefully followed them along the forest path. The fears were confirmed. Going a couple of 100 meters into the forest, the man threw the child on the ground and began to tear off his clothes. At that moment, cadets Angelov, Krylov, and Popov detained the intruder. As it would later turn out to be recorded in the case, the murderer, seeing that he had been caught, exclaimed, "I regret that life is over." The monster caught by the hand turned out to be Vladimir Georgievich Vinichevsky, born in 1923, a student of the 7th grade of one of the Sverdlovsk schools. The identity of the criminal, who was only 16 years old at the time of his arrest, caused a shock to the police. The investigators expected that the criminal might be young, but could not assume that he would be a minor. They were looking for a young man of 25 years old, possibly disabled, but not a child. The boy, who had been committing horrible crimes with impunity for more than a year, had 8 dead and 10 wounded at the time of his arrest. The criminal was operating both in Sverdlovsk and in Nizhny Tagil, where he came to visit his relatives. Not all the Tagil episodes were known to the police, as some children were simply missing. Nelyud told about the murders unknown to the police, and another child's body was found in the cesspool of one of Nizhny Tagil's residential neighborhoods. The penultimate murder Vinichevsky committed in the small town of Kushva, killing their 3-year-old Katya Lobanova and also hiding the corpse near her house, in the pit of the toilet. The maniac tried to perform natural copulation with his first victims, but due to the anatomical features of the victims, it was impossible. Then Vinichevsky began to commit anal intercourse, which brought him pleasure only when the victim was strangled. Vladimir Vinichevsky was a child from a completely prosperous family. His father, George Ivanovich, was a foreman in the municipal economy of Sverdlovsk, and his mother, Elizabeth Petrovna, worked as a bookkeeper at one of the enterprises of the city. The boy did not need anything. The search showed that in his passport were unheard of for a schoolboy in the 30s riches: a penknife, which was used in attacks, leather shoes, and good even by adult standards clothes. In the pockets of the maniac were found expensive chocolates, with which he lured children, as well as 20 rubles of money, which amounted to 2 days' wages of a factory worker. Vladimir's classmates told investigators that the boy was not very sociable and always had money with him. Vinichevsky did not deny himself the pleasures of going to the cinema, theater, or circus almost every week, where he often invited his friends. Interestingly, one of Vinichevsky's friends, who was questioned particularly carefully by the investigators, was Ernst, a future famous Russian sculptor. The boys were friends, and Vladimir often invited Ernst to keep him company when going to the theater. At school, the killer was characterized as a calm, non-conflicted child with poor academic performance. In order to find out the circumstances of some murders, investigators of the criminal investigation had to compare the information received from Vinichevsky with the school journal. There were cases when the maniac had time to commit an attack, having a window between lessons, which was no more than an hour. Parents, having learned that the ruthless killer and rapist was their son Volodya, abandoned him. They left the following statement in the editorial office of the newspaper Uralsky Rabochi: "We, the parents, renounce such a son and demand to apply to him the highest measure, firing squad. There can be no life for such freaks in a Soviet family." November 1st, 1939, 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Vladimir Vinichevsky, who was not too familiar with the laws, behaved calmly and confidently during the investigation. Not knowing about the existence of a decree on the application of capital punishment to persons under the age of majority, he was sure that he would receive 10 years, which in the pre-war USSR was the maximum punishment for young criminals, regardless of their crimes. The sentence, which sounded on January 16, 1940, firing squad, shocked the freak. Vinichevsky panicked and immediately began to write petitions for pardon, but all of them were rejected. The maniac also asked to be sent to the front. At the time of the murderer's trial, the USSR was fighting in Finland, where he was ready to atone for his guilt with blood by becoming a tanker, but his petition went unanswered. In May 1940, Vladimir Georgievich Vinichevsky, who was 17 years old at the time, was shot at one of the firing ranges near Sverdlovsk and buried there. At that time, the bodies of those shot were buried in mass graves, and most likely the maniac ended up in the same grave with the victims of the repression machine. It is an interesting coincidence that Ernst, a former classmate of Vinichevsky, half a century after his execution, created the Masks of Sorrow monument dedicated to the victims of Stalin's repression at the site of the shooting. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel and put a thumbs up. Look forward to more stories from the team of our channel. This is Criminal.